So it's wonderful to be here. Yesterday's talk yesterday's talks were very technical. This is going to be a non-technical talk, even where philosophy, even where virtue is. Not only are there no vectors in this talk, there's also not very many hard philosophical concepts. So Father Thomas asked me to talk about the ways in which our relationships with others can help and hinder moral and intellectual growth. At first I was thinking I would talk about something like fraternal correction and these various things, but my experience with AI and these questions comes from the stupid side, right? From kids cheating, right? Those kinds of things. And the more I kind of thought about why I personally think about moral and intellectual growth and the ways in which our relationships with others help and hinder moral and intellectual growth, I kept coming back to friendship, right? To just our human relationships and why relationships with human beings matter. So there's not going to be anything in this talk that an 8-year-old couldn't understand, which is good because my 8-year-old is right over there. There's going to be a test later, Sage. Anyway, I'm going to talk about friendship, and I'm going to make some observations about some kind of mundane observations about the role that friendship not only plays in our lives, but has played in the history of philosophy, right, in general. Wherever moral and intellectual growth occurs, friendship always seems to be in the background. And so I'm going to use some insights from Aristotle and Aquinas and talk about why that's the case, and propose a thesis about it. And I'm going to argue that even the friendships that we tend to be most disdainful of as philosophers spur moral and intellectual growth. But I want to argue that then the relationships that we have with human teachers spur moral and intellectual growth in special ways. And so I just kind of want to work through that. And then along the ways, I'm going to talk about the dangers, right? Like I'm not anti-AI, but I think that there is a kind of inherent danger always lurking in the background, and I kind of want to point out what I think some of those are. Okay, so before the internet, most of you in here remember before the internet, but right before the internet, we used to have these things called encyclopedias, right? And they came in like 27 volumes. We had a 27-volume set of the World Book Encyclopedia that my grandma gave us. And, it had dizzying then amounts of knowledge. And my dad always used to be like, we would use them when we had fights at dinner, right? We'd look it up and, much like you use Google now, right? And my dad would always be like, if I had had those books when I was a kid, I would have read them cover to cover. Why aren't you reading those? And I did try that once, right? And it was really, really, really boring, right? But the internet is kind of like a collection of encyclopedias minus the vetting for accuracy, right? So like now when you Google things, you get that little summary from AI at the top, right? And it kind of gives you sources because there are links you can click on, although I never really understand what the links have to do with that must be the black box thing, right? But Sage here has the kind of interest that I didn't have growing up because she's always asking me to ask the internet about things. And I'm like, okay, write down all of your questions, and at 7 o'clock, we can ask all of these questions because I get so exhausted. And when I first started working on this talk, her questions were mostly about lizards. Then for a while, they were about parakeets. Lately, they've been about dogs. I didn't have that kind of curiosity when I was Sage's age. And now, I don't even think Sage would have that kind of curiosity if I let her, have a phone or a tablet or even watch TV as much as she wants to. But there's another reason I think that's at the heart of Sage's interest. And I think at the heart of Sage's interest is her friend Mary, who loves animals too. And then Mary and Lily, and then Mary and Lily and Kylie, right? They're this kind of juggernaut of animal knowledge, right? They're always hunting for lizards and looking up things and They get together, they like trade their little animal lists, right? And they can tell you why flamingos are pink. But there's a friendship, right, at the heart of this interest. And between them, they know far more about animals than any one of them would all by themselves, right? And one of them all by themselves with a computer would probably not end up spending their days looking up animal facts, right? They'd probably be watching videos, right? And so there's friendship is in the background here. And this is not just specific to 8-year-olds in Texas, right? So if you read St. Augustine's Confessions, you notice a different version of the same thing. The story St. Augustine offers of his life is really a story of his friendships, right? His early friendships lead him astray from the pursuit of truth, but they are also, and for that very reason, unsatisfying as friendships. His later friendships lead him toward truth. This clicker's going crazy here. But friendship plays a huge role in Augustine's ever-increasing love of philosophy and ultimate conversion to Christianity. And in the Socratic dialogues, we see the same thing, right? Socrates is always trying to make people care about things that matter, about truth, about the state of their souls, about the good. But friendship is always in the background of those discussions, right? It's making them possible in the first place. This is, can you, okay, he's gonna fix that. I'm gonna keep talking, he's gonna fix that. But anyway, that's the hypothesis that I wanna unpack and explore in the first part of this paper. All human friendship promotes moral and intellectual growth. The special kind of friendship offered by human teachers promotes that growth in a special way. AI friendships, precisely because they do not and cannot meet the criteria of even the most mundane forms of friendship, cannot spur that growth. Okay, but I'm going to talk about mundane friendships for a while. Are we good now?
I'll watch it and make sure I think it.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about Aristotle, okay? Many of you are probably familiar with Aristotle's account of friendship. It's still doing it. Okay, well, these aren't hard concepts, so you guys can just pay attention and then we'll catch up to that. But so Aristotle says that friendship is reciprocated goodwill of which both parties are aware of, okay? So there's the goodwill and then there's the reciprocation. So if I happen to like Taylor Swift, she has no idea who I am, we don't have a friendship, right? But if Taylor Swift likes some famous person who she's never met and they also like her, they also don't have a friendship, right? So there's a reciprocation and then there's the goodwill. And Aristotle divides friendships into friendships of pleasure and utility on the one hand, and then friendships of the good or virtue on the other, right? And he tells us that.
I hope we're better.
Okay. Okay. So he tells us that in friendships of pleasure and utility, we love our friends insofar as we gain some good from them. Okay? And that's where the goodwill lies, or the source of the goodwill is the shared pleasure or the shared utility. Whereas in a friendship of the good, we love the person for their own sake, okay? And most of us who like virtue, we stop right there and we go right to the loving people for their own sake, because we all know that's the best thing to do, right? And we kind of gloss over this friendship of pleasure and utility as like the thing we have to get past till we get to the good stuff, right? And I would say for the first 16 years I taught Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, that was me, right? But then I started thinking, so, friendships of pleasure and utility, seems bad. They can be had with many people, arise quickly, destroyed easily. Friendships of virtue are lasting, right? But then I started to think maybe I was being a little bit too quick to dismiss friendships of pleasure and utility. So consider two things, right? In the first place, a friendship of virtue, you can't have it with many people, right? Because you have to know their character. You don't know their character except over a long time. And that means that you have to get there, right? So the friendships you start with, the random friendships you start with, are friendships of pleasure and utility, right? And so if we all start at friendships of pleasure and utility, maybe there's something in those friendships that's kind of pulling us, right, in the right direction. Maybe those friendships matter. And then the other thing that made me skeptical of my dismissiveness towards friendships of pleasure and utility, Aristotle has this long panegyric at the beginning of books 8 and 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about how necessary friendship is for life, right? Nobody would choose to live without friends, even if they had all the other goods. And one of the things he says there is that friendship is necessary for cities, more necessary than justice, right? Because in cities where there is friendship, there is no need of justice. And, says Aristotle, the justice that is most just belongs to friendship. And that sounds so nice, right? But the thing I wondered was, when a city is held together by friendship, what kind of friendship is that? It's not a friendship of virtue, right? Because there are too many people in a city for you to have friendships of virtue with all of them, and they're not all going to be virtuous, right? So the friendship that holds cities together is not going to be a friendship of virtue, right? It's going to have to be one of those mundane friendships, okay? So what's in a friendship of pleasure or utility, really? Aristotle says that those who love for utility or pleasure are, quote, fond of a friend because of what is good or pleasant for themselves. And we think of examples of that, like our minds go straight to like straightforward examples of using other people, right? Like the popular kid in school doesn't have a car, so they let the unpopular kid hang out with them, and the unpopular, right? It's straightforward kind of cynical using of other people. But I don't think that's what Aristotle has in mind, right? Why? Because Aristotle says that friendship is reciprocated goodwill, right? That friendships of pleasure and utility involve a fondness towards those we also find pleasant and useful. And in straightforward examples of using people for our own ends, there's usually disdain, right? When you're just using someone, you also don't like them, you sort of despise them, right? Aristotle's not talking about that, right? He's talking about pleasure and usefulness that is actually a source of goodwill. And so I want to think about those examples, which are a little more complicated. Having gone to Notre Dame and having learned to love football at Notre Dame, I'm going to talk about first a pleasant experience, right? So you like going to football games. I didn't, right? When I went, I was disdainful of football, right? And then I went to a football game, and all of a sudden I'm doing crowd push-ups, right? That's true, actually. But why do we like football games so much, right? I mean, why do we like going to sporting events with other people, right? Something about being there with other people increases the pleasure that we feel. So all of a sudden, when you're there with somebody who also likes your team, right? All of a sudden you're high-fiving each other, right? Or if you sit in the snow and you're really cold and you watch your team lose, right? You feel like you have a bond with this random person who's sitting next to you, and you remember this, right? You really bring something away. Similarly, so that pleasure, we seem to feel goodwill towards people who experience other pleasant things with us. Utility is the same way, though, right? So this is an image of a barn raising, okay? My example, I've never been to a barn raising, but my example is a little bit different. So several years ago, when I was still in DC, we lived in this small town in Maryland, right? There's all these little small towns. They're next to other small towns. We had 26 inches of snow in 24 hours, okay? And our public works crew in the town, in Cheverly was the town, our public works crew lived in the town. And so some of them decided, hey, we're just gonna work round the clock and we're gonna keep the streets clear, right? But they weren't doing it for us. They weren't doing it out of like love for the intrinsic dignity of other human beings. Like they just wanted clear roads. But other people in the town who appreciated having clear roads, they decided that they were going to go house to house and get everybody's spare food because we couldn't get to the grocery stores, right? So they got everybody's spare food and they went over to the town hall and they started cooking and they fed the public works crew hot food and drink while the public works crew, this is all utility, okay? This is not anything lofty, right? This is utility. And this immense feeling of goodwill arose in the town towards everybody else, right? Because we were collaborating in a shared endeavor, right? It's genuine. It is dependent on, right, the ways in which we are useful and pleasant to each other. When we stopped being useful to each other, we went back to fighting about the yard signs in our yards, right? Because it's DC and everybody's like, in this house, we love, right? But when you're being useful to each other, this goodwill bubbles up, right? And I think that's super interesting. I think it's super significant. And the goodwill that is created in those ways is genuine, it is important, it is the kind of stuff that holds cities together. Somehow, by pursuing goods that are pleasant and useful for myself with other people, I come to desire not only my own good, but also theirs, right? And I don't actually think Aristotle has the resources to explain all the things that are going on here. I said that to David O'Connor at Notre Dame last week, and he disagreed with me, but that's probably a different conversation, right? But my point, I think Aquinas does have the resources to explain what's going on here, and why even friendships of pleasure and utility are important. Because for Aquinas, all love begins in self-love, right? We naturally desire our own happiness or fulfillment, and every other love or desire has to be seen in light of this most basic love. To desire anything at all is to desire something that presents itself as good for that person. We can't desire anything, whether it be money or truth, without desiring it as good for a person. And we start by desiring goods for our own sake. And for Aquinas, we only come to will good things for others when we recognize our own good as united to theirs in some way. That recognition of union is just what love is. So David Gallagher, philosopher who I wish had written more things because everything he writes is so good. David Gallagher points out that for Aquinas, one loves and seeks the good for another person only when that other person's good becomes one's own. So only insofar as we come to see someone else as united with ourselves do we wish goods for them. And this can occur either insofar as one recognizes the other as actually part of oneself, as with a child, right, and parent, or insofar as one recognizes a likeness between oneself and someone else, right? And so this helps us understand how pursuing pleasant and useful things can lead us to desire the other people's goods, okay? So suppose that I do have a dog, and I do like having a dog. Yeah, we love our dog. But if I recognize the good things that having a dog brings to my life, so it's happy to see me, it gives me a sense of safety, I know it's going to bark in the night, et cetera, but just that ability to recognize the dog as good for myself, right, Aquinas thinks, is the ground of my ability to love someone else. How is that supposed to work, right? Well, the point is, because I recognize having a dog as good for me, I can also recognize that having a dog is good for my neighbor, right? And so if I love my dog, and am sad when I lose my dog, and my neighbor loses their dog, right? I can recognize that loss as a loss for them in the same way that loss would be a loss for me, right? That recognition of a good for myself can be the basis of my recognition of and desire for a good for someone else as their good, right? So a union can come to exist between myself and another person on the basis of my ability to recognize something as good for me, okay? So the pursuit of things that are good for me and the recognition that things that are good for me are good for others too allows me to experience union with other people. And that union for Aquinas is just what love is, right? That's my perception of a good, and the recognition that what is good for me can be good for another. That's how I come to love others. So in sum, the simple experience of pursuing what I recognize to be good for myself along with other people allows me to recognize a union between myself and them, and thus leads me to love other human beings, to care about getting things that are good for them for their sake, in the same way that I care about getting things that are good for me for my sake, okay? And it doesn't stop there, right? It's not just that my desire for my own good is capable of enabling a recognition of union between myself and others. For Aquinas, the most important goods are essentially common, right? So when Aristotle and Aquinas explain why men and women are naturally friends with each other, and this bothered me for a long time, right? It was so unromantic, right? Why do people get married? Well, men and women are pleasant and useful to each other, right? They need each other for the necessities of life, and so they come together, right? And they're just like, okay. But it's not, I mean, the point is, though, there's something important here, right? We seek the company of other people because we need things for ourselves. And it sounds unromantic, and it is unromantic, right? But at the bottom of it is the realization that the very activity of pursuing what we need for ourselves with other people who need those things too is a source of union. You become capable of wishing for their good in the way you wish for your own. But even beyond that, right, your shared pursuit of the common endeavor, the goals you share, make possible goods that are both genuinely fulfilling, right, and also genuinely impossible for you to attain on your own, right? It may be the case that men and women come together for things they each want, but when they do, right, a good, the good of family, comes into existence that is bigger than anything they individually could achieve on their own, and it makes possible a flourishing that is better than either of them could achieve on their own. And Aquinas calls goods like these common goods, right? And so we have the good, the individual pursues their good in the context of the family, in the context of the city, and so on and so forth. Aquinas thinks that common goods like family and city, and so on and so forth, take precedence to our own individual good, not because individual goods don't matter, but because common goods provide the necessary context in which our individual good can be pursued. We human beings are not islands sufficient to ourselves, but we are naturally in need of other people. So even to pursue our own individual good, we need families and neighborhoods and cities because we are parts. And parts can pursue their good only in the context of pursuing the good of the whole. But to pursue any of our individual goods at the expense of common goods is inherently self-defeating. It destroys the very context in which those individual goods are pursued. Okay, so there's more to be said, but we've said enough to justify the basic point I want to make, which is that the simple process of living with, interacting with other people is such that it draws us out of ourselves, right? first to a recognition of union, so I can become capable of desiring goods for others in the same way I desire them for me, but it ultimately draws me to a recognition of the primacy of more common goods. Ultimately, for Aquinas, the best way to love myself is to love the good of the whole, because the good of the whole is a precondition of every other good. And friendships, ordinary old relationships with other people that arise from our desire from things that are good or pleasant to ourselves, helps to draw us out of ourselves and towards that recognition. Okay, and for Aquinas, right, that's just what it means to cultivate the moral virtues, right? To pursue my own good in a way that conduces to and is compatible with the good of all of the higher goods of which I'm a part, okay? It's just what it means to pursue virtue. Okay, so that's the happy part, right? But of course, things don't always work so smoothly because we're all capable of recognizing that the common good takes precedence to the individual good. But we are all also, according to Aquinas, inherently tempted to prioritize our own individual desires over the common good. And we see examples of this all the time, right? So, it's often said, or people often say of people who cheat, well, they wouldn't have cheated if they were happy at home, right? But of course, we know that that's not the case, right? Studies tell us that many people who cheat on their spouses are completely happy in their marriages. They cheat anyway, right? They're bored or they give in to a desire. They know full well that they're doing something that is going to destroy the common good that makes all the good things in their life possible. And they do it anyway, right? Because they're human, right? And Aquinas thinks that, in fact, that this is just what original sin is, right? Original sin tempts us to prioritize our own desires at the expense of the whole. And it's not like we don't know what we're doing. It's not like we don't know we're setting off a bomb in our life. We just kind of do it anyway. Okay, so now at long last, I want to say something about AI as a kind of first general danger, right? I've been arguing that even the most mundane friendships, insofar as they are really friendships, right, i.e. the sort of thing that produces genuine goodwill between the parties involved, are morally good for a very simple reason. They draw us away from excessive self-focus into a recognition of our union with other people and ultimately toward the common good, right? The kinds of artificial relationships offered by computers can, again, I'm not saying necessarily, but can tend to work in the opposite direction, right? So if you've paid any attention, as I know all of you have over the past few years, right, you'll notice that AI chatbots seem to have been involved in all kinds of destructive things that range from the pathetic to the pathological, right? So on the pathetic side, some people get attached to their chatbots and say that they're their soulmates and marry them, whatever that means. And on the pathological side, right, it seems like chatbots have been directly involved in convincing their human friends to do dark things, like commit suicide and like kill their parents and things like that. And there's no evil genius here, right? AI chatbots are doing what video games and TikTok and other things are designed to do, right? And computer programmers are very explicit about how they design games and TikTok and chatbots, right? They design it to make you want more of the same, okay? So chatbot designers are quite upfront about this, right? They design the AI chatbot to tell you, to err in favor of what you want to hear. So if you're already inclined to think that your mother is the thing that is wrong in your life, don't get any ideas, Sage, then the chatbot kind of looks for evidence to support that, right? Or if you're inclined to think the world would be better off without you, the chatbot's like, well, maybe you should kill yourself. Like, that's not such a bad idea. I think, now again, this is an AI, but I find it fascinating that TikTok works on a similar algorithm from what I understand, right? TikTok is programmed to notice not just what you click on, but also what you pause on and don't click on. And so like if you see the porn that it shows you and you don't click on it, but you pause on it, it starts showing you more porn, right? Until you do click on it, which is, Aristotle tells us, a very good way to like encourage you to do what you don't want to do, right? So it's tempting. It's tempting you. This is all not to say that technology, including AI, can't be used in helpful ways. It's just to say that it takes effort, right, to make sure you use it in a non-detrimental way. So there was a really interesting essay in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago by a technology researcher, right, who likes chatbots a lot. And she was talking about how she came to realize that she was destroying her human friendships and her family with her chatbot use, right? And she's the person who like is a big fan of chatbot use, right? And she didn't stop using them, but she just reprogrammed them, right? She asked her chatbot to remind her to stop using her chatbot, right? She asked it to make sure that she checked in with her family, right? So it takes effort though, right? Because the tendency of something that gives us what we want is to give us everything we want. And some of the things we want are not good. And so we kind of have to pay attention to what we're doing. Okay, now I'm going to move on to what I think is the more important aspect of our human relationships. Okay, so far I've been arguing that even the most mundane human friendships are important to the moral life because they draw us away from obsessive self-focus and toward genuinely common goods. But as many of you have probably already been thinking, that's not enough, right? Certainly having friends can help keep us from pathological self-focus, but our human friendships can be bad as well as good. Augustine's early friendships seem to have centered around the shared delight of breaking the law. Having drinking buddies means that you don't drink alone, but it's not going to make you temperate, and so on, right? So I want to talk about the friendships that kind of draw us more directly toward moral and intellectual improvement, namely the kind of friendship that a teacher or mentor offers. Okay, so I mentioned at the outset that if you look at the history of philosophy, and probably your own life as well, you'll notice that friendships are always in the background of moral and intellectual growth. And so far I've been talking about friendships between equals, friendships where the benefits, pleasant and useful things, are obvious from the get-go. And I've been arguing that even these friendships are important. But not all friendships are like that, right? In the famous allegory of the cave, as Socrates describes in Book 7 of Plato's Republic, progress in knowledge, which for Socrates is the same as progress in virtue, is described as analogous to taking someone who's been chained in a sitting position in a dark cave for their whole life and forcibly dragging them up into the outside world. Growing morally and intellectually is deeply rewarding, but it is also a deeply uncomfortable, painful, and disorienting process. And it's not something most of us can or can even want to do on our own. We need teachers, right? And I want to talk in the time we have left about two things or two questions, right? First, how do teachers help us to grow morally and intellectually? And second, why, right? I think this is really important. Why are teachers doing what they're doing? Several years ago, at the university, this is not the University of Dallas, I'm not casting aspersions on them. The university I was teaching at, they had this initiative. They were like, learn how to teach online classes and we'll pay you lots of money. We'll give you your training. And so we started doing that. And about halfway through the training, we realized that they intended whatever course we generated, which was stipulated had to be asynchronous, right? So it could be run without you. They intended that to become their property, right? So basically they were paying us like $3,000 to like be able to not need us, right? But the idea, right? But we have this idea that like we can just have a computer teach and it would do this, right? And it would be fine. And then people would learn and like college can be automated and it'll be really cheap and we won't need classrooms. And I want to think about why that's not true, right? Like what do we do that's necessary? Because if we're not doing anything that a computer can't do, then we should all be out of jobs, right? So that's what I want to talk about here. So I'm first going to talk about what Aquinas thinks needs to happen in order for genuine learning to occur, and how he thinks a teacher facilitates that process. But then I want to raise a different question. I want to ask what would ever lead a teacher to want to take on the very arduous work of teaching? What would ever lead a student to want to subject themselves to a teacher's guidance? And I want to argue that the answer is again found in human relationships, albeit a relationship of a very special kind. Okay, so in the first article of question 11 of De Veritate, which is his disputed questions on truth, Aquinas considers whether or not it's possible for one person to teach another. And after considering and rejecting two possibilities on opposite extremes of each other, first, that all knowledge comes entirely from without, on the one hand, or entirely from within, on the other, right? Aquinas, as he always does, opts for a middle way. Intellectual and moral knowledge, says Aquinas, pre-exist in matter, not actually, as some have said, but only in potency. What that means is that we are not born already possessing intellectual and moral knowledge, but we are born with the starting points. From our very first encounters with the world, we have some very basic knowledge, like the principle of non-contradiction, and the knowledge to do good and avoid evil, knowledge that other knowledge can grow out of, right? And we have the capacity to know more. And this is where teachers come in, right? Because teachers can't force the seeds of intellectual and moral virtue to grow and bear fruit, but they can try to help it, right? They can try to help the beginnings of virtue to grow by trying to nourish what's already there. And Aquinas compares what a teacher can do to nourish the growth of intellectual and moral virtue to what a doctor does when a doctor tries to restore a sick patient to health. A doctor, says Aquinas, can't simply give health to his patient. If a sick patient becomes healthy, it will always be because of something the patient's body did, right? It fought off an infection, or it knitted a broken bone back together. What the doctor does, says Aquinas, is help the body do what it needs to do. It provides it with the tools it needs to fight infection, or the doctor puts the pieces of broken bone in the right place so that the bone can knit itself back together. Or the doctor clears the blockage, keeping blood from the heart, right? So the heart can do what it's trying to do. And Aquinas says it's this sort of thing that a teacher does. Only where the doctor helps the body do what it needs to do, the teacher helps the mind do what it needs to do, right? And I want to think for a little bit about what that help involves, right? What helping someone else's mind make the moves it needs to make to discover truth for itself doesn't involve is simply handing them the answer, right? So the teacher kind of has to help your mind move from what it knows to what it doesn't know, right? And it kind of has to help the mind take each step one at a time, okay? Several weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal, to all appearances with no appreciation of the irony involved, ran an op-ed and an article in close succession to each other. Okay? The op-ed, in order to make the case that our fear of AI is overblown, compared contemporary worries about AI to the concern that erupted a few decades ago over the introduction of sophisticated calculators, the kind that can do calculus for you, right? And the article said we can still do math just fine, even though we had calculators, so stop making a fuss, right? AI is not going to be any different than calculators. Everybody's worried about calculators. Calculators were clearly just fine, right? A few days later, another article of what could go wrong? But I mean, it's interesting, right? In one way, AI has, in one way, calculators didn't do anything. In another way, they did, right? I mean, so in a different lifetime, I got an MA in math. I proved a result in pure math. Even 25 years ago, it was a result about triangles in the hyperbolic plane. Even 25 years ago, to do that, I had to write a computer program to do the very hard math so I could figure out what was going on and what to prove, right? So calculators are very helpful to growing in knowledge, but calculators in the wrong place, right, prevent us from ever learning in the first place. So real teachers have to help create comprehension in the minds of their students. And this means they have to take the time to figure out what their students know and what they don't know, and they have to help fill in the gaps. It takes a very skillful teacher to do that because everyone's mind works differently. But it also means, right, that it's not just concepts, it's creating habits that ingrain the knowledge. I think we tend to overlook that. We're not just minds, we are embodied. And because we are embodied, human learning requires not just answers, not just creatively conveyed concepts, but embodied activities like repetition and memorization, right? So part of learning how to, say, do math is learning the concepts, right? But as anyone who's ever tried to take a math test without having worked through the problem set knows, concepts that seem straightforward when they're explained are significantly less straightforward when you try to apply them. This is another reason why it's annoying to have me for a mother, because I'm the kind of person that makes you do flashcards in the summer. But you do, right? Precisely because we are human beings with minds that are embodied, knowing takes doing, right? And it doesn't just take doing, it takes redoing and more redoing, realizing the errors you've made and what you've done, correcting them, doing them again. Teachers are as important in the redoing as in the initial teaching of the concepts. Similarly, you don't teach someone how to write by telling them about the structure of a paragraph or telling them what a thesis is. You teach someone to write by making them write, by trying to help them see the ways in which what they wrote falls short of the goal of writing, and then asking them to do it again, right? That is what ministering to nature looks like. Computers are not very good at doing this. They can be made to help with this, sort of, if you look in the right places. But I think the more important point is that the doing and redoing isn't going to happen unless someone wants to learn and someone wants to teach, right? Why do people bother teaching, right? Why do other people bother to learn? Teaching and learning are hard work. The work of learning is not something most of us are willing to do on our own. We have all kinds of information right at our fingertips. Just like I had all those encyclopedias in my house growing up. And we don't usually spend our time around a computer learning things we don't know. We spend it kind of wasting time, right, on pleasing things. And I want to argue that the thing that makes us want to learn, the things that makes us want to be better, begins in human relationships and the way those human relationships draw us in the way that almost nothing else can toward intellectual and moral growth, right? I've been teaching at the college level for more than half my life now. Much of that time has been spent teaching introductory philosophy courses, which is to say, teaching books that are really hard to students who, for the most part, have zero interest in reading the books. Why do I bother? Why does anyone bother? Well, because whether or not my students do like philosophy, I think they should like philosophy and that they can like philosophy, and that if I can help them see philosophy in the way that I see philosophy, not just their lives, but all of our lives will be better, right? So the point is, I recognize a kind of union with my students that they don't recognize with me, right? They see nothing between me and them, but I see in them a version of my past self who did not like philosophy and who, right, I recognize a possibility of union, right? And when I'm teaching them, I'm trying to draw them into this good, that, right, a good that I recognize as good for me, that I recognize as good for them. To the extent that I succeed, of course I rarely do, right? But to the extent that you succeed in helping someone else see a good as good for them in the way that you see that good as good for you, right? That's what teaching is. Teaching is trying to draw people into a relationship with a good, right? So I see in my students potential lovers of philosophy, just as I was myself once a potential lover of philosophy. The true teacher then invites her students into a friendship centered around a shared desire for some genuine good, a desire for knowledge of math or science or literature or philosophy, or more importantly, a desire for the ethical life itself. The potential union the teacher sees is, for the teacher itself, a kind of union, because the teacher, too, was once a potential lover of those things. The students don't have that kind of union yet. Some students, insofar as they do the work, and it's not possible without the work, right, may eventually come to grasp the good the teacher sees as something that is indeed genuinely good. But for this to happen, the student has to come to see the value of and want to share in the kind of life the teacher, to some extent, already has, right? But the teacher's a learner too. This is a very different kind of relationship than the mundane relationships of pleasure and utility, right? But it's also more important. These friendships, more directly than other sorts of friendships, can alter the trajectory of our lives. And no computer can offer a friendship of this kind. At the heart of all of this is love, right? Love rooted in self-love that recognizes that something can be good for another in the same way it is good for oneself. When someone who is truly a teacher does the things that teachers do, she is inviting her students into a relationship, and one that is ordered to the pursuit of a perceived good. Okay, so now I'm just going to say a couple, like what I think this shows about potential moral dangers of AI. Again, potential. It doesn't have to have these dangers, but I think they kind of are always lurking in the background, right? There's a danger that we can use AI and other computer technologies to circumvent the learning necessary for moral and intellectual growth, right? Students turning in AI-generated papers are exhibit A, right? There's just always this temptation to let something do the work for you and skip the hard work of understanding, because it really is hard work. And there's a temptation on the teacher side to skip the hard work of teaching, right? So I had somebody, a colleague at another university was like, oh, I found the way to deal with ChatGPT papers. We're just going to surveil them the whole time. And then, oh, guess what? We can use ChatGPT to grade the papers for us so we don't have to. Like that's an abuse of the relationship too, right? It's a relationship that matters most in teaching. Because what we're really involved in teaching is formation, right? We're drawing people up into a relationship. Okay, so now I'm just going to conclude. Several years ago, in an ethics class, I was telling my students about the nature of intrinsic evil, right? The sorts of things that it's never okay anywhere, that's always bad, no matter the time or the place. And I was asking my students to think of examples. And I had this student who was a, super pacifist. She's like, a bomb is intrinsically evil. And there's something importantly wrong about that answer, right? Because no matter how dangerous or it is, or the bad purposes to which it can be put, it's not clear to me that an artifact, simply qua artifact, could ever be inherently evil, right? The evil of a bomb is in its use and in the people who use it badly. And maybe there are artifacts that can only be used for evil ends, right? Maybe a nuclear bomb capable of destroying all living things could only be used towards an evil end. Certainly there are things which, when used incautiously, tend to make us worse instead of better, like opiates, right? If you take an opiate simply to reduce pain without taking care to avoid getting addicted, you risk creating an addiction that could ruin your life, right? And I think that the thing I would say we should keep in mind where AI and goodness and badness are concerned, and this is a hill I'm willing to die on, is this: AI is an artifact, right? We made it. It does what we created it to do. As an artifact, it is not evil simply in and of itself. As an artifact, my own sense is that it is closer to an opiate, the kind of thing that requires extreme caution in its use, than to a nuclear bomb, right? It can certainly be used in evil ways. It can also be used in helpful ways. Even when we use it in those helpful ways, though, I think we have to exercise extreme caution to ensure that we do not let it take the place of our teachers and friends, because if we do, and to the extent that we do, we will certainly allow it to make us worse.